You hear me? Yeah, good. Okay, so I'll start by showing pictures of two of my friends, not because one of them is male and one is female. The point is a bit of a different one. We got together at a conference some time ago, and we started talking about the fact that isn't it annoying if you are, for example, these people study fungi, that when people talk about sex or sexual selection, they always have something in mind that is a bit like humans or dogs or birds reproducing, when the rules can be much more flexible when you go to other taxa. And we thought it would be a brilliant idea to write an edited book about it, where people who study these fungi and other things could tell what a narrow-minded bunch all of us others are. Then we got to a census and thought, you know, an edited book, that's terrible much work. We might as well approach a journal. So this is what then happened. Philosophical Transactions got interested. So in September 12th issue last year, that's titled Weird Sex, the Underappreciated Diversity of Sexual Reproduction. So this is the selection of chapters that we managed to, you know, twist people's arm to produce for us. And you can see there's all kinds of stuff going on in there. And I thought I'll just pick my favorite bit of natural history that I learned when I was guest editing this a theme issue for the journal. And I think it's from this one here, Schwander and Oldroyd. They talk about androgenesis, which is basically asexual reproduction by males. You wonder, how's that possible? Well, they do it by essentially hijacking eggs, kicking out the female genome from that, so you develop as a clone of your father. But this is not all. There are some systems described in this chapter where females, I think this is stick insects, they sometimes manage to more or less accidentally produce eggs that are empty in the sense that there's no nucleus. And of course, if a single sperm comes to such a thing, it doesn't really do very much. But if two sperm enter that kind of egg, you can actually get embryo development, and you develop as a, I don't know what the name of that is. And it even works between species. So the egg can come from one insect, and then you get a different kind of sperm going into it. We also tried to get a review of a topic that I think is really fascinating, which is that sometimes you can get extreme different morphologies between the males and the females. So here's an example of a barnacle. Here's the female. You can see these tiny things here. This is what it looks like. That's not a body part of the male. That's the entire male. And of course, I mean, this should make you think, as in, if this is possible and all the male function that's ever needed can be done like this, why are we actually usually so similar to each other? So I started my career by studying something like this, then I moved on to something like that, and nowadays I enthuse to my students whenever I read an interesting fact about, this happens to be paramecium, for example. So why has this kind of development happened to me? I think what makes biology so cool is that there's this eternal tension between what is a general fact and what are the specific examples that look totally fascinating. Like here we have a Drosophila. Everybody knows a lot about it. Here's something that you can pull out of a rainforest tree or your museum collections or something like that. So if you do have a good theory, ideally you should be able to understand both. You should understand why males and females are normally roughly similar looking, and why sometimes you get these absolutely crazy exceptions, and can you even predict where these exceptions are going to lie? In other words, if somebody just changes the rules of the game, what are the predictable responses in the traits or maybe the behaviors that you get in there? That's all that I really study in various forms. Or another way to explain why all the sort of weirdness of, in this case, sexual reproduction interests me, is that it really can provide you with a bit of test cases for whether you have understood the whole thing in the first place. So sexual reproduction, we all know that that's one of the really big mysteries in evolutionary biology. Why does it happen at all? Why have these sort of incredibly complicated ways of creating the next generation? And a lot has been written about the benefits, potential benefits of sex. So I'll just pull out a couple of new reviews on this topic. So you can talk about the breaking up of the unfavorable allele combinations and or more quickly at a population level, searching for the better combinations of alleles that are now necessary in the potentially modified environment, biotically or abiotically, like we heard about in the previous talk. In a finite population, they wouldn't otherwise come together so quickly. Or it also protects against Miller's ratchet, the idea that the sort of perfectly adapted mutation-free genome doesn't exist after a while anymore. Or these are kind of like the same things, but they're expressed in a more statistical language. There are associations built by past selection and how that responds to various challenges. But what is intriguing me right now, and this is a talk, by the way, about very unfinished stuff. Keep that in mind, because my own thoughts have been evolving quite recently about this. So almost countless papers have been written about the benefits and how they work. And often they come with models. And a problem, I think, with the models is that they kind of mention that sex is costly. That's why we have a problem in the first place. But to implement this cost, they kind of throw in a life cycle without really very much justifying why do you assume this kind of organism or this kind of life cycle instead of another kind. So for example, and this may sound a bit funny, but models vary enormously about whether they have males in them or not. Sex often comes with males, but not always. And to understand that, you need to remind you of what is actually the definition of a male. A male is the sex that produces the tiny gametes. It could be pollen if you're a plant, it could be sperm if you're an animal. But the definition doesn't really work unless you have this phenomenon called anisogamy, which means that these things are different sizes in the first place. If you don't have that, then the preferred language is to talk about mating types. They are often called plus and minus or something like that. So sex like this is not really the same in terms of the rules of the game as sex like that. This is yeast, which is not an isogamous organism. It's isogamous. Or then you can have more wacky ways of getting genetic material from your environment. This is tardigrades, and they have all kinds of fungal and plant and other kinds of genes in their genome acquired through whatever means. And this is relevant because, and now we come back to John Maynard Smith, who was already mentioned in the previous talk. He was the first one to point out that the famous costliness of sex, which is usually quantified as twofold, although it's a bit of an approximation, this twofold cost of sex is really a cost that relates to the fact that males exist when they exist. So all else being equal, if you have males in the system, you expect halving of the population growth rate. And this is how it comes about, and I'll show this in a little cartoon. There are three different hypothetical populations here, but I'll start on the left side. Here we have a happily asexual population. So these are two different females. And what I draw here as pink is the stuff, the resources they can gather from their environment to produce 5 young each. So the total population produces 10 young, 5 for each parent, and this is clonal reproduction, okay? We can also have sex, but in a way that doesn't really have the males as a specialized phenotype. There's no male-female dimorphism. And sometimes people think that, okay, well, now you have the meiosis, and you have to accept that half of your genome comes from another individual, so therefore there's this sort of twofold penalty, in a sense. But if you only focus on that, which is kind of like the split here, then you ignore the fact that in principle you should also get double the number of reproductive opportunities, because now you get access also to the resources that this other individual is gathering from its environment. So each parent now has the capacity to participate in the production of 10 young, but half the relatedness. But 10 times 50% is actually the same as 5 times 100%. So you don't really get this twofold cost there as a net effect. And it's only once you start to have sex with males that you end up with trouble, which is depicted here. I know it sounds funny. Where, and this is an assumption, the males are assumed to be interested in nothing else when it comes to production of the next generation than to outcompete other males. And the reason is that they are now producing these tiny little sperm. They can create way more of them than can ever fertilize the female eggs. And that's why they suddenly need to be very worried about getting ahead in the game, ahead of other competitors. So now, in a sense, you're kind of choosing the wrong number from each of these columns to create your reproductive strategy. And this is why evolutionary biologists puzzle so much about sex. But it's really arising once you get the males there. So this is now the ongoing work in my lab. We wanted to, well, firstly, we have been collecting a gigantic table of all the assumptions ever used in sex models. I'm not going to show you that. Basically, the outcome is that, there's a lot of assumptions in there. But we wanted to, for once, keep the benefit side constant. We just assume certain kind of variations in the environment that you have to keep adapting to, but we systematically vary the assumptions about the life cycle. So there's a bit of text here, but I'll just run you through it quickly. What were the first 6 that we tried, and we are now in the process of modifying this, and I'll tell you why. So firstly, the green thing here, I colored green because this, in my naive thinking initially, I thought this will be the best ever case scenario for the evolution of sex. It's isogamy, so you don't have these annoying males, and also you have an asexual backup. If you don't happen to meet anybody suitable, you can just go back to asexual reproduction. So you don't have mate finding problems, really. You can always reproduce one way or another. You could also have isogamy with commitment, and by commitment I mean that once you have decided I'm going to do sex, you cannot really revert that decision. And this is blue because I'm kind of thinking about an ocean where there's broadcast spawning. Once you have shed your gametes into the ocean, there's no way, if they don't meet anybody, you can't really call them back and say, let's start again. Then here we could be thinking that we are on land again. We can have hermaphrodites, organochorists, or dioecious things if you're a plant person. So the sexes can be together in the same individual, or they can be in different individuals. And in either case, you might be mating randomly, which is the top row here, or having sexual selection in there so that there's a stronger selection acting on males than on females, because now you have males or male functions. I could show you the results, but I'll just summarize them with one sentence, which is that we ended up confused. And the confusion was that I totally intuitively predicted that this would lead to a lot of sex, and we would have a lot of trouble elsewhere because the costs are bigger. But it just sort of seemed to be totally drifting up and down, more or less. And we didn't understand why until we created a different plot out of what was actually happening in that simulations. And this was just the plot of how often did you, the individual in the virtual world, volunteer to undergo a sexual cycle, but you failed because you didn't find anybody. And, this thing where the asexual backup is there, that's now depicted as green. I've skipped some of the other options. And here we have some kind of like environmental variation on the x-axis. And the important thing to notice is that these green dots are often very high at 1, which means that in this particular case, for example, at the end of the simulation, whether they wanted to have sex or not, they always failed. Why was that happening? And this was a bit of a kind of like a aha moment there, because once again, I caught myself thinking that, well, sex is a little bit like, sex in birds or mammals. This is Fisher, where... And I put Fisher there because he, of course, is the father of sex ratio theory, where we kind of think that, well, once you have these things called sexes or maybe mating types, there's some sort of a mechanism that keeps them roughly at 50-50 sex ratios. But when he developed that theory, he was thinking about organisms like this as well. So they have anisogamy and they have obligate sex. Every generation, every offspring is going to be produced by one father and one mother. And we already know from haplodiploid insects that that's not the case anymore, let alone these things, these tiny little creatures that I was imagining that can actually be facultatively asexual. So then I realized that I actually need to read a little bit about the natural history here because I had been just making an assumption in the model based on very little anything else than ignorance. So this is what I was thinking as a sort of basic null assumption of what might be happening. Let's say that we have the plus mating type and we have the minus mating type, so no sexes, just mating types. And let's say that there's a bit more of the red ones than the green ones. What's going to happen? Okay, these ones can fuse. And what kind of offspring will they produce? Well, I was thinking maybe something a little bit like Mendelian randomness happening there. Whereas this one that has the asexual backup might, the offspring might just look like the mother, if you want to call that the mother. So that's what I was assuming, but it introduced interesting consequences for the dynamics. Because sex is facultative here, you don't have to use it. If you don't find a mate, you can just keep propagating your mating type. So you don't end up with the frequency-dependent selection that is underlying the whole of sex ratio theory. And therefore, these things just, the frequencies drift up and down. And at some point, one of them here, the green one, happens to fix, the other one goes extinct. And now, no matter how much you might want to have sex, you will never express that desire because everybody is of the same mating type. And if you run that in bigger population sizes, it just takes longer for one of them to fix. But there's just nothing balancing or lifting the mating success of the rare type or reproductive success of the rare type. So extinction is going to happen. So then it's time to actually read a bit of natural history. And then you find these absolute gems about adaptations that seem to be there to make sure this doesn't happen, that sex actually can keep going because these organisms seem to have evolved to worry about the mating type availability. So this is my favorite example, and this is why I enthuse about finding things about paramecium. Already in the 50s, which are the references here, somebody figured out that in a particular strain, they basically switch mating types with a light-dark cycle. So it's a bit like if you don't like me like this, then at nighttime I will look like that, and you can even speed up the process by making them undergo light and dark cycles quicker, and you can sort of just the same individual can act as one over the other with some limits to how quick you can make this process. And I think Fisher, of course, he was thinking about a bit more traditional type of organisms from our perspective, but I think he would have found it quite fascinating to work out the mating type ratio dynamics that go on in systems like this. Or here's another thing that I found out when I actually started reading this literature about small creatures. Very famous study organism, Chlamydomonas. Very well understood, one of those model organisms when it comes to algal reproduction. And what's special about this life cycle, I'll just sort of go through it briefly. You have the fertilization here. You get the diploid zygote, and pretty much immediately you undergo meiosis. So you could call this the adult stage, the vegetatively dividing stage. That has already undergone meiosis. So it's not just later at the gamete stage like in humans, but already these organisms have the ploidy level that is the same as their gametes have later. So the ploidy changes here, not here like in humans. And that has an interesting consequence because they have a backup option. If these gametes don't meet anybody, and by the way, this is a facultative sexual organism in the sense that they tend to start to have sex when they are somehow stressed, unhappy, hungry. That's when it's time to do something a bit different. So they do that. But let's say that you add food to this soup of gametes. They're kind of like, oh, maybe it was a mistake to try to have sex. They can just grow straight back to adults without fusing with anybody else. And of course, this is the thing that I mean by knowing the rules of the game. If you don't know that this is an option, then of course you're going to get the dynamics really wrong when you build your models. So therefore, what we have done now, or are doing at the moment, is to throw out the previous results because I thought I was just a bit naive, hadn't bothered to read anything. And what we are doing now is to look at this problem of facultative condition-dependent sex a bit more realistically. So what we have here is a population of individuals, and those that look a bit pale and they're in the sort of dark green region, they are the not so terribly well adapted ones for the current environment. And often the ones that end up somehow in a poorer condition, they are the ones that volunteer for having sex. It's a bit like the abandonship idea that you're an allele that would quite like to live in a better body and better genetic background than the current one, and therefore sex is a way to kind of jump onto a better phenotypic ship. So this is what typically goes on there. The ones that are totally happy with their current situation, they might refuse to participate in that game. So then we can say that the threshold for how bad do you feel, what do you need to feel about yourself before you volunteer for sex is the evolving trait. Okay? I don't know why that's funny. But then we need to be explicit about the assumptions that we are putting in the model. So do we allow backup reproduction? In this particular example that I'm going to show you, I'm going to say that that's a no. Do we allow mating type switching like this paramecium was doing very cleverly? And let's first consider what happens if the answer is no. And then here are some results. And literally I was looking at these yesterday on the plane on the way here. This is all brand new. And the plane ride was quite bumpy, so I was a bit like, oh. So I don't understand everything here yet. But what's clear here is that, you know, we don't get much sex. This is 5 different connected populations with a bit of immigration between them. So you can see that sometimes they still volunteer a bit here. But they very rarely get the chance to actually express that, only when there's an immigrant of the opposite mating type from somewhere else, where mostly things have just fixed. So you don't really say that this is a model that explains why sex happens a lot in the world. The same thing, but let's now say that this backup reproduction, remember this algae, if that can happen, but mating types are still inherited like this, the way that I was explaining in the first part here. Kind of similar, sex lasts a bit longer. What you can see here is that initially, when everybody is really quite happy still having sex, they often fail, but now it doesn't immediately pull down the sexual reproduction because you still have this asexual option, so the genes that would have been volunteering, they don't get penalized as quickly. But at some point, even though you still would be volunteering here, you just run out of the mating types as predicted. And after that, the volunteering thing is pretty much a neutral trait. It doesn't matter because it's never expressed. But if we give them the maximum flexibility, backup reproduction is possible, mating type switching is also possible. So basically, you know, like if you're born, it doesn't really correlate what kind of parent you had, what kind of mating type you have now. You might also switch during your life. This is a reality in a lot of microbial systems. Yoo-hoo, sex persists quite nicely here. And you might think that, well, it's not kind of like 100% no, but if you have ever tried to model the evolution of sex, it's actually really hard to get it going. So it feels quite a sort of nice thing to have here. We are not the only ones interested in this thing. So these are 2 papers just from last year. So Zena and Pom and Bram, they have been looking at not really the evolution of sex with or without mating type switching, but assuming that sex exists, why does the switching evolve? And showing that it really is quite an important part of these systems. It's also nice to mention here because it allows me to show this picture of Pom being licked by a cow in the Swiss mountains. That's always a plus. Also, if you are interested in so this is a mathematical model. This is more about the sort of diversity of the biology involved there. So clearly people are getting interested in this. I'm sure that Fisher would be happy if he was alive because this would give him all kinds of interesting ideas what to model next. But luckily he's not alive, so we can do it. So what I'm hoping to do next, and I didn't have time because the flight was too short, is to go back to introducing males into the system. So I had these sort of backups and mating type switching possibilities and things like that within isogamy, but a lot of nature actually looks like that, where the males are there. And I think that might actually make me reassess the picture, you know, remember the pink blobs with the resources and things like that. Because what was in that picture is that in the middle I was always assuming that these things will find each other. In these simulations, I've started to realize that they don't always find each other. But the nice thing about systems where you have males around is that usually access to sperm is not that hard for a female. There are exceptions, but males at least, and it can also be just a male function in a hermaphrodite if you want, they do provide this service of lifting the constraint on sexual reproduction, which is the, having to find somebody because they tend to be selected to make it quite easy for females or female functions to find them. So maybe, I haven't done this yet, but we might get even more sex when maleness allows some individuals, or if you're hermaphroditic, parts of individuals, to be very generous about accessing their gene pool. And that can be important for the following reason. Here we have again the gradients. Here are the very happy, the genotypes that are very well adapted, and here are the slightly sick ones. The problem in my simulations so far is that if only the relatively unhappy ones volunteer for sex, you can only sort of get mixing between these types that are not particularly great anyway. You don't really, these ones are totally happy being parthenogenetic, so they don't really allow the eagerness to have sex to spread through their reproductive avenues. But that's totally different here, because even if, and this works in gonochoris as well, but I just sort of want to make you think more diversely, so here's a hermaphrodite. This might say that, well, my female function is so happy with itself because I'm so well adapted, I will refuse to have sex with my female function, but if somebody comes along and says, oh, here's an extra reproductive opportunity, they might still be quite happily donating the high quality sperm with a lot of adaptation potential into the system. Maybe, this is just my verbal thinking, but that's what I'm going to look at next. So why is all that relevant? We know there's different systems. The small creatures, they tend to reproduce in different ways from the big creatures. But the interesting thing about this is that in the evolutionary history of sexual reproduction, one seemed to come first, and that seems to have maybe some interesting consequences. So this is a former PhD student of mine, Jussi Lehtonen. He had Jeff Parker as an examiner of his thesis, and that was a really good thing because Jeff liked one chapter in particular about his work, so they got collaborating later, and I kind of tagged along still a bit. So this is what came out of it. This is in the same special issue that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So just realizing that when sex first evolved, it really wasn't of the kind that we see around now in these sort of dogs and horses and whatever. There's pretty good evidence that the ancestral state was facultative. The capacity for asexual reproduction was there. And also, these things could appear in a slightly different order, but also it didn't have yet males and females. If you then start having an isogamy evolving, so now by definition you do have males, you end up with a derived state, and now this twofold cost of having to produce the males and things like that happens and arrives. What you could also have, and this is a totally verbal model, we don't have any maths to back this up, but you could imagine that maybe the males don't happen so quickly in some lineages. And then you end up with, because costs of sex might be relatively low without these males, you might end up with situations that basically always use sex as part of their reproductive cycles. And I'm putting them here as without constraints because you still have in your recent evolutionary past a history of doing asexual cycles as well. So if, for example, the males now start invading this system, then you do have the option of reverting back to complete asex. Sex is now so terribly costly, why not avoid it altogether? And these are the sort of asexual invasions that plague every model trying to understand why sex is so common, because if you put an asexual type in there, they spread really easily, and the whole thing becomes totally blue again, asex. So here the costs of sex are avoided because you don't do it in the first place. But we also know that the long-term lineage success of these kind of things is a bit meager because adaptation is difficult, so you end up being quite rare. And then what you could have, though, in some cases, is that you avoid the male evolution for quite a while, and you become so used to doing sex all the time that it becomes a standard fixed feature of your life. And you cannot really, if you try to revert back to asexual, you just don't have the right mutations in place, or often these days, if, for example, hybridization creates asexuality, they're not really, they're a bit clunky. They don't usually have perfected the asexual lifestyle because they have all kinds of traits that are kind of assuming that sex should happen. And if males evolve in such a system, you just don't react to that really, because you don't have the option of reverting back to asexuality. So there might be costs of sex happening here, but it's also pretty irrelevant because, you know, you have sex anyway. So a lot of life might actually be derived from these cases. We know that a lot of life is sexual. A lot of life has males. Sometimes you might break the constraints and go back to facultative sex or asexuality. But the point here is simply that if you study organisms like this, you have to understand that their evolutionary history is quite different, and probably the rules of the game are quite different from here, which you might also choose as a study organism. So don't think that they're all equivalent. But okay, so this was published last year, but now it's 2017, and I'm already realizing that, oh, if I was writing this paper now, I might make a bit of a different point than here, because I've been telling you about these simulations where I'm saying that, well, you know, sometimes the male thing, the costs are not just the male production and the resource use and things like that, but there's also these mate-finding troubles that the presence of males might actually ease for populations. So whether we can always say that the costs increase when we go that direction, I'm not so sure anymore. But that's fun. It's fun not to be sure. So I think I'll end this talk about showing another chapter from Jussi's PhD, which was explaining why these arrows here exist in the first place. Why are systems so vulnerable to the invasion of males, if you want to express it that way? Why from these sort of happy plus-minus systems you so often end up with systems that have sperm and eggs? So this is basically a question of size of the gametes. Why, given that they can be of the same size, they often end up being a different size? So if you think, for example, about this is a cloud of gametes trying to find each other when corals are spawning. The question is, what size should a parent be producing? And therefore, as a consequence, also how many can you afford to produce? Smaller things are cheaper than larger things. And everybody always thinks that it was Jeff Parker who started studying this field in the 1970s. That's actually wrong, because the field is older than that. And this is a fantastic paper. If you don't read German, it's a bit less fantastic. But it's fantastic for a specific reason, which is that during a time when there was already mathematical treatments of evolution, there wasn't usually things like, let's take a specific problem and try to understand it with a mathematical model. It was much more the sort of generic, you know, which allele might win and so on, without specific biological mysteries. But here, this guy took a specific biological mystery, which is why are there two different gamete sizes, and trying to look at it with a mathematical modeling technique. He used statistical mechanics on particle collisions to determine the population-wide rate of zygote formation. And then the next paper on that topic was kind of using the same thing, but adding gamete mortality depletion due to previous gamete fusion, so making the whole thing a bit more dynamic. Parker was aware of these papers, but he writes a little bit dismissively about them for a particular reason, which is that they pre-assume that there's cooperation in the system, that everything in nature is about maximizing the population-wide output of what might happen. Later, we realized in the 60s that individuals can have conflicting interests, and it's not so guaranteed that such an optimization criterion will work in nature. So these were dismissed as a bit group selectionist, and then came Parker's famous model, where he took a very different approach, where, and this is just you can barely see these small things here. There's supposed to be tiny gametes here and big ones there. But he was assuming that initially everybody's roughly the same size, with maybe a bit of variation, which I'm exaggerating here. And there's pros and cons to being big or small. So if you are producing these tiny ones here, you can, for the same amount of energy, you can produce more. It's of course nice to produce the big ones, because they will contain the necessary material to actually start a life and get going and grow and so on. And then, of course, what you get is that these ones might have the idea of just going for the big ones to fuse with. There are losers in this game, and these are really the ones in the middle, that they are trying to be a bit big enough, but they don't really yet survive very well. They are also not small enough to lead to very high success in this competition, which later becomes sperm competition. So this has led to this sort of language like males being parasites that specialize in searching for the resource providers who do the real job. And this is a very different way of thinking about it because it introduces sexual conflict at the very beginning of any kind of an isogamous male-female interaction. Some people, by the way, don't seem to like this thing, so this is from a relatively recent paper complaining that why is such an ugly term, parasitize, needed to describe the, this beautiful thing that happens between males and females. So what UC did was actually we were not trying to participate in this debate, kind of like, parasite or not to begin with. What our interest was actually, we felt that it was a bit of a shame that these old papers had been completely dismissed because they happened to use the wrong optimization criterion. Because the mechanics, the statistics, and the sort of physics of the thing is actually very nicely modeled in there. So what we wanted to do, and this is kind of how the model works, we wanted to take this idea that these two parents, they might have different interests, and then see what happens when we follow it dynamically. So there's a certain kind of budget. You can divide it into small or large gametes. Here we can already see that the blue one has started to produce a bit smaller ones, so I think there's one more here than there. And then this is my proudest PowerPoint moment ever. You can see the zygote forming, and then there's some survival that happens after that and so on. But we also need to figure out what happens dynamically, given that not all of these can ever hope to meet somebody, whereas meeting is probably a bit easier for these. It depends on the population densities. So we vary them in the model. How easy it is to meet each other depends on how close the other parent is. So what we have here, I don't want to call them males or females yet, because they might evolve to be just in the middle, and if everybody is the same size, you don't actually talk about males and females, so I'll just call them red and blue. So here's a situation where there's very few adults interacting in any local pool of water. Imagine some sessile marine invertebrates or something like that. And isogamy is actually the solution. This becomes different if we increase the number of interacting adults, and then we actually get situations where the isogamous equilibrium is unstable, and you will evolve so that either the blue ones are really big and the red ones are small, or an alternative equilibrium where the colors are the opposite. So depending on which ones ends up being the big one, you call that color the female. So this confirms that the sort of Parker logic works even when you go into the sort of full dynamic setting of the thing, so that's fine. But the exciting result is the following, which is that we have, this is the same model, we can also change some other parameters there. There's actually 3 different ones that all work in the same way, and they all make it somehow more difficult for the gametes to actually meet each other. So for example, you can make them survive a shorter time in the seawater on average than when this parameter is smaller. Or you can make the adults live further apart so that they have to swim longer to find each other. And then you get a very similar, so this is where we started, a very similar transition to an isogamy, but this time it's actually based on cooperation. Because for the female, it's also really great that the males are now producing these searching machines, lots of them, because otherwise she would actually end up having her eggs unfertilized when she's in this faraway corner of the world. So the kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek take-home message here is that if you ever worry about, do these male-female interactions in the world, at the origin, are they actually cooperative or are they indicative of conflict? Well, it depends on, population densities of ancient marine invertebrates. Jeff Parker would say that, well, they were probably always high, so conflict prevails. But I guess the other thing is that these mate-finding difficulties, which you can somewhat release if one sex specializes in producing these searcher phenotypes, that can actually sometimes be quite important for the maintenance of sex in the first place, and that's what we are working on at the very moment. If I still have time, I think we started a bit late. Is that, yeah, okay, I'm doing empirical work as well. So this is somewhat a changing tack, but it's kind of linked to the theme of what do organisms actually do when they can have males, but they don't have to. So the perfect study organism for this is Daphnia. So this is Tvärminne field station in Finland, and I don't actually carry the buckets myself. I've got very good postdoc and a very good PhD student who spend their summers there, and I can come there and say some nice words. So the idea of this experiment is the following. This is the organism. Sex allocation, like I said, it can be much more flexible than what Fisher thought. And for example, in Daphnia, we don't even have proper theory for it. We're actually developing the theory as well. But the reason we can't just apply the old idea straightforwardly is that Daphnia females can do three things, and they can alternate between them. They can produce eggs that need to be fertilized by a male. They can produce female offspring that are clones of their mother. They can produce male offspring that are also clones of their mother. So sex determination has nothing to do with chromosomes or whatever. And if you have this, then you have an interesting trade-off, because female production is great in the short term. You produce a lot of daughters, they can directly produce daughters, so you fill the ponds really nicely. But the problem is that all these daughters, none of them can survive the winter. It's only the sexually produced eggs that can do that, because they go dormant. So you have to have had sex before the winter comes, and for that you have to have produced males at some point, or somebody has to have produced males. So what should they do, and how do they actually tell what time it is in the season? The later it is, the more you should probably have sex and or produce males. But it could also be that other individuals have already produced the males, so it will be pointless to add to that, because they just end up competing with all these others. So that's what these experiments, you saw these buckets, are doing there. We just manipulated the sex ratio, so we can't change what time of the year it is, but we can make the Daphnia perceive that it might be a bit later in the season because the bucket is already quite full and there's a lot of males. Or we might also keep the density constant, but there's just more males swimming around you and also trying to mate with you and so on. And then the question is, what do the females do in all these different situations? And what they do is that if you add females and it gets more crowded, they actually start producing males. The males now have more fertilization opportunities. It's also a signal that it might be late in the season because initially populations are smaller than later, so that makes sense. But the really cool result, I think, is that if you make the same changes but these additional individuals are males, we can compute that for every male added compared to a female added, the male production, it still increases, but only about 40% as much as if you had added a female. And that, when you think about it, makes sense, because if there are already a lot of males in the population, it means that, oh, it's late in the season, so we kind of should produce males, but they are also a bit counterproductive to produce because they are competing with all these others. So there seems to be these quite flexible sex allocation rules. And what was really satisfying in there, that we have repeated this experiment with slight modifications 3 times, and these are kind of responses, adding females, adding males, and you can see that maybe you can see the slope of adding males for the response is a lot lower than the slope that you get from the female addition. And with a bit of variation, it's remarkably constant across the experiment. So for once, science is actually repeatable, so that's nice. And I think I'll kind of end there. The first conclusion is, I already said this, I'm not going to repeat it. Remember that not everything is a Drosophila. And I am a bit confused about how and when and whether males are a good thing or a bad thing in a lot of systems. And I really enjoy that, so that's it. And here's the thank you slide. Jussi is one of these, I'm not quite sure which one, and here's the other people. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay. Before you leave, we just want to give you a small token of our appreciation.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's a nice creature.
Insect from Norway. We have, of course, as well for